I'm Sarah Morgan from Rothamsted Research, and I am a postdoc research scientist specialising in grazing systems. And today I'm going to talk to you about maximising the value of your grazing for production and environment. So traditionally, grazing management has consisted of set stocking or continuous grazing, and these kinds of systems rely on minimal infrastructure, have fixed watering points, and have a relatively low labour input. There's also systems such as a relaxed rotational grazing, where you kind of move your animals from field to field, and also strip grazing, but I'll note that this is strip grazing with just a front fence, where you move that across the field as the animals move day to day, but they have access to the residual and the water trough behind them. The downsides of these types of grazing systems is that they use low to medium stocking rates, meaning that you've got no control over the grazing pressure. They have no or short infrequent rest periods for the grass to recover after grazing, and they allow the animals to selectively graze. So these cause some issues in terms of you have a lower annual forage yield. For a set stocking system, you can expect about 6 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year. And on a continuous or relaxed rotational grazing, you may achieve about 8.5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year. You've got poor utilisation of the grassland, and by utilisation, that means how much of the grass is actually eaten from the animal versus wasted. And in set stocking systems, you have a utilisation of only about 50%, so that means half of the grass you're actually wasting or is being rejected. In a relaxed rotational system, you may get about 60% utilisation. There's a lack of flexibility within the system to deal with when there's feed surpluses or deficits, and also in terms of inclement weather, so if it's very hot and dry, or equally very cold and wet. You have difficulty to maintain grass quality and an even sward height, and that comes back to the lack of flexibility in the system and the fact that you don't have much control over your grazing pressure. The sward persistency and diversity can be reduced, and this is a particular issue in terms of multi-species swards that are becoming more popular. And this is caused by the selective grazing that can happen, and that selective grazing can cause areas of land and some of the pasture species to be overgrazed, and you eventually lose the productivity in those areas or lose those species completely out of your sward, whereas other places can also get undergrazed, so that's sort of areas of land or species that are rejected by the animals. And you also get an uneven distribution of the dung and urine across that field. So more recently, there's some new methods of grazing management. These are just a few examples here. So some people do the hub and spoke system, and the advantage of that is that you've got a common water point, and you basically divide your fields up to smaller paddocks from that water point. Paddock grazing, where you just subdivide your fields into smaller areas, and then going to more sort of management intensive systems. You've got mob grazing, where you've subdivided your fields further and you use higher stocking rates still. And then there's systems such as cell grazing, where they give you full flexibility and control over the allocated grazing areas and your stocking rate. So these systems use high to very high stocking density. They give you very good control over the grazing pressure, and you can have prolonged and adjusted rest periods throughout the grazing season to suit the time of year and the expected grass growth, etc. And it discourages selective grazing because the animals are enclosed in smaller areas and at a higher stocking density. Then they're kind of forced to eat everything that's in front of them until they move the next day too. However, these systems do require additional infrastructure, such as electric fencing and extra water points, And also access to water can be sometimes tricky, so you either need multiple watering points or movable troughs. And they have a higher labour input and management within them to get the best out of the systems. The overall principle behind these systems is graze and rest, and there are other systems out there and other terminology used, such as adaptive multi-paddock grazing, high density, low frequency grazing, pulse grazing, management intensive grazing. The list is getting quite long, but ultimately these systems all centre around the principle of an intensive grazing bout and then a rest period for the pasture. So these kinds of systems offer some opportunities in terms of improving and getting more out of your grazing. So in these systems, it's been shown that you can increase your forage yield, and some systems can achieve over 10 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year. You can increase your utilisation of the grass because you've got better control over the grazing pressure, and you can allocate your feed to your animal demand. Some of these systems can achieve up to 80% of utilisation. You get improved grass quality that you can keep at a more consistent position across the growing season. You get better sward persistency and diversity, as these systems don't allow animals to selectively graze, so you discourage any overgrazing or undergrazing of particular areas or particular species. In these systems, it's important to budget and allocate your grass availability versus your feed demand, and within this you can predict ahead any shortages of feed or surpluses and act accordingly. There's a higher animal performance per hectare, and that is tied into improved land use efficiency, which I'll come on to later. And you can also extend the grazing period because of the flexibility within these systems. You can adapt your stocking density to suit the time of year. So at the shoulders of the grazing season, when it's slightly wetter, you can give animals a bigger area so that they are not compacting and poaching the ground as much, or you can move them more often, etc. And this extended grazing period means you've got a shorter housing period and thus reducing the costs associated with housing. So I choose these modern grazing management methods. Well, there's been a lot of work done in terms of the productivity and economic benefits of these systems, and ultimately with your increased pasture yield or pasture production, coupled with better utilisation, an extended grazing season, using higher stocking rates in the farm overall, and achieving a higher live weight gain per hectare, that all adds up to an increased profit margin. There is a lot of interest in terms of the environmental impacts of these types of grazing systems though, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there to show that these systems can lower your inputs such as fertilisers, pesticides, etc. A very key area of interest is about sequestering carbon into the soils, and it's claimed that these systems can increase the amount of carbon being sequestered. You get improved nutrient distribution and also improved biodiversity. But I'd say the majority of these environmental credentials are based on anecdotal evidence, but there's a big body of anecdotal evidence out there, so it shouldn't be avoided. However, currently there's little conclusive scientific evidence that actually supports these anecdotal claims. So one project that is looking to rectify this is the Agritech Cornwall Cell Grazing Project, which is being conducted at Rothamsted Research Northwick. And the whole aim of this study is to quantify and compare the environmental impacts of contrasting grazing management systems. So within this study, we are comparing set stocking, which is at the sort of extensive traditional end of the grazing management spectrum, versus the cell grazing system, which is much more management intensive. You've got very fine control over your grazing management. So this study began in April 2018, and it's using dairy cross beef steers within the systems, and they're grazing a typical pasture found in the UK, which is classed as an improved lay, which was reseeded in 2013, and it's a replicated statistical design. So that means any results that come out of this are sort of statistically and scientifically robust. So I'll share with you some of the preliminary data that we've got so far from this experiment. In the top right here is showing the carrying capacity of the systems. In terms of the set stocking systems, we've achieved a sort of overall carrying capacity of around about 1,500 kilograms of live weight per hectare. Whereas, as you can see in the cell grazing systems, which are the lighter blue, this has actually increased year on year. So we started at just under 2,000 kilograms of live weight per hectare, and we are now at over 2,500 kilograms of live weight per hectare. In terms of the animal productivity, the daily live weight gain is in that first line of the table, and SS is the set stocking, and CG is the cell grazing system. 2018 was a bit of a challenging year to start a grazing experiment, so we didn't get animal performance as well as we would have liked, so that's why the daily live weight gain is lower than you would expect, but it's improved year on year in both systems. You will see that the individual animal performance is lower on the cell grazing versus the set stocking, and that's because there seems to be an antagonistic relationship between individual animal performance and performance per hectare. Now, in the third line down, you can see the live weight gain per hectare, and year on year this has been higher in the cell grazing system and has increased year on year as well compared to the set stocking system. So to put some context on that, there was a 10% difference in live weight gain per hectare in 2018, but as I say, that was a very challenging year to run a grazing experiment in due to the drought. In 2019, there was a 61% difference in live weight gain per hectare, and then in 2020 a 39% difference. And I was pleased to find that in 2020 we managed to produce over a tonne of live weight gain per hectare in the cell grazing system. To flip that on its head, the bottom line there is basically how many hectares is required to produce 1 tonne of live weight gain. And as you can see, as the years have gone by, the amount of land required to produce a tonne of live weight gain has decreased, and you can see by 2020 we actually needed less than a hectare of land to produce 1 tonne of live weight gain. These are some of the botanical survey results, comparing the spring of 2018 to the spring of 2021 on the set stocking and cell grazing. If we focus on the left there in the table, you can see the proportion of bare ground on the set stocking system has decreased significantly. So there's a 13%. It's decreased by 13%, whereas on the cell grazing it's remained pretty similar. In terms of the proportion of perennial ryegrass, set stocking has gone from 36% to 54%, which is an 18% difference, whereas on the cell grazing that has gone from 42% in 2018 to 70% in 2021, being a difference of 28%. The other grasses haven't changed that much in the set stocking, whereas they have decreased quite a bit in the cell grazing, and also the white clover is decreased on both systems, but markedly so on the set stocking. These are the soil chemistry results. As you can see on the left there, the darker blue lines are the set stocking and the lighter blue is the cell grazing. And it seems that the organic matter on the cell grazing systems is increasing at a quicker rate compared to the set stocking systems. But I'm eagerly awaiting 2021 soil chemistry results to confirm that trend is continuing. A similar but smaller trend has also been seen in the available phosphorus. So you can see some of the cell grazing systems are approaching index 2, whereas the set stocking ones are all index 1, and again waiting for 2021 results to confirm that trajectory. The available potassium, however, seems to have increased at the same rate on both systems, so it doesn't look like there's a system effect on available potassium. So in terms of wrapping this up, in terms of grazing management's role in achieving net zero, improving your grazing management can improve your utilisation and productivity per hectare, and that will free up some grassland areas for other uses such as biodiversity habitat and woodland, etc. Increasing the nutritional quality, dry matter yield and extending the grazing season will reduce the reliance on bought-in feed, and that helps in terms of the reducing land competition, particularly between feed and food, but also the increasing competition for land used for fuel production. Accelerating the accumulation of organic matter and carbon into soils, which is a very key area in terms of grazing livestock systems, and a very hopeful area. And that sequestration of the carbon is to offset the other greenhouse gas emissions from the system. So that includes the carbon dioxide, the methane from the ruminants, and nitrous oxide, which is mainly from fertiliser inputs. And also enriching above and below ground biodiversity through the addition of organic matter stimulates the below ground biological activity, and pastures that are varying in height within the grazing rotation will offer a wider habitat selection for insects and birds. So I'll leave you with this little anecdote just to think about. You could either spend your time trying to purchase land and expand, which is very expensive and quite difficult, or you could change the way you graze what you already have and reap the rewards through buying more infrastructure rather than more land. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions. My contact details are there on the right. Thank you.